All right, so we'll go through a little update on the RTRN network and some things that we were sort of discussing at the RCMI Program Directors Association meeting a couple weeks ago in Bethesda. So share some ideas that people have been discussing and be able to get some additional feedback and input from the community here in Puerto Rico, and then we can have some more discussion during the lunch break. So the overall goal of RTRN, the RCMI Clinical and Translational Research Network was designed to be a thread that runs through the RCMI community to help the RCMI community, each institution within the RCMI community, partner together in a more seamless fashion. And the main piece of that is this sort of data and technology. Well, there's a couple main pieces. One is the Data and Technology Coordinating Center, which provides infrastructure particularly for conducting clinical trials and to be able to do those clinical trials with a level of rigor that's accepted by the FDA. The second important piece, is how to bring investigators together to be thinking, to bring thought groups and teams together across the RCMI community. And that's sort of through the research core that Dr. Yanagihara heads up. And Dr. Perkins heads up the Data and Technology Coordinating Center. So and then all together, the network along with the institutions, hopefully we can reduce racial and geographic disparities in health and improve the well-being. As Dr. Schroeder said, if we can improve the well-being for poor communities, we should be able to improve the well-being and health for all Americans. And so I think if we can solve complex problems in communities that have fewer resources, then we should be able to solve these problems for anybody. So one of the objectives of the network was to integrate the translational research capacity, or at least as we think about going forward, can we better integrate the translational research capacity with this multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary collaborative research across the RCMI community and the different RCMI institutions? Can we and how do we more effectively harness the talents and expertise of RCMI investigators? Really important. How do we effectively harness the talent and expertise of RCMI investigators, particularly in uncovering social, economic, behavioral, cultural, environmental, perinatal, genetic determinants of diseases? Because these are many of the factors that really have a tremendous influence, particularly in our communities, because of who we are, right? And so if we can really understand how many of those factors influence health and determinants of health and disease in our communities, then we can really make tremendous impacts on the health of our nation. And we also have the opportunity, because as a network, we have a lot of geographic and racial and ethnic similarities and differences. So in partnering, we can actually look at unique relationships between different communities as we think about how we might try to understand some of these complexities that can influence disease and health. And then how do we reduce comorbidities associated with key health disparity conditions? So how do we take the science and really improve health and yet at the same time understand not just the basic science, but the behavioral sciences, the social sciences, to bring them all together to influence and hopefully improve health. So as we look at the Translational Research Network Enterprise, and we're looking at the next iteration, we've been working with Program Office. So when we're getting feedback from Program Office at RCMI, but we've also gotten feedback from many of the RCMI program directors. Today we're going to get feedback from a lot of investigators in Puerto Rico. So the Research Coordinating Center, which is really the Data and Technology Coordinating Center that we have. One idea is a Translational Research Ambassador Program. I'll talk a little bit about that. And let me step back. So with the Research Coordinating Center, and then the Data Coordinating Center. So the Data Coordinating Center, that's more data. The Research Coordinating Center, per se, is going to coordinate thought groups and how investigators come together to think about problems and funding for pilot projects, things of that nature. How do we put those pieces together, the actual conduct of research, and then the Data Coordinating Center is helping to support that. Deploy newly developed tools and recently refined applications for research networking and resource discovery. So we talked about, okay, if you want to get people together to get a team, you want to get a team together to work on a problem, how do you know who? So you might just say, you put an ad in the newspaper. Say, I want everybody who might be interested in this problem. And that's one approach. But another approach might be, is there a tool where you can, and you might want some people who are not actively working in a field, but you might also want some people who are actively working in a certain area. Or you might want individuals who have certain expertise to be part of that team. How do you discover who those individuals are? How do you uncover the profiles for those researchers to say, wow, I didn't know that person at Ponce was doing this work. I want to invite them to be part of the team. And then I didn't know that somebody at Caribe had this core lab that was measuring these assays. I want them to be part of the team. But right now, do we have the tools that somebody can do a quick search and pull that information up to invite those people? Probably not. If your institutions are like my institution, you probably don't know most of the things that are on your campus and what the capacity of the core labs are and what people are doing. And so how could you think you might know what's going on other campuses unless you just happen to know? And so how do we get these tools in place? And two of them, we'll talk a little bit more about them. So one is Vivo or Profiles. Vivo is, and Ponce is actually part of the process for the implementation and development and implementation of Vivo, which is a tool for searching individuals by their profile. So Harvard, Vivo was created by, I think, Cornell, or at least Cornell is the major institution behind it and is working with a consortia that includes Ponce. Profiles is the Harvard version, but they have cross-compatibility. And these are tools that once the information about the investigators are loaded into these tools, you can then search and find investigators by querying for certain attributes that you're looking for. Okay. The other is the resource directory. What core lab facilities exist on our campuses, particularly within the RCMI community, that might be really important for collaborating as part of a team for a particular project, right? So we might not. So we want not only investigators, but we want to know, are the resources there, and so how those resources become discovered. Right now they're fairly invisible, and so Eagle Eye is a parallel project that looks primarily at resource discovery versus sort of investigator discovery. There are 4 RCMI institutions involved with the Eagle Eye project right now. UPR is one of them, University of Hawaii, Morehouse School of Medicine, and Jackson State. And so we have, so the good news is we have at least 1 or more RCMI institutions as part of each of these projects. These are national projects for trying to develop what many believe will eventually be the platform for discovering and searching for scientists and resources for the entire nation. So these are 2 large ARA-funded $15 million projects over 2 years. That's just a bunch of crap we did, so don't worry. So the steering committee for RTRN has approved the IRB harmonization process, but again, as we heard, that's still going forward, so we still have a lot of work to do on that, but that's something that we really want to implement and finalize. I think the other aspect that is really has not been on our RTRN radar screen for IRB harmonization has been the affiliated hospitals. Right? So primarily we've been just trying to work to get harmonization across the institutions. But affiliated hospitals would be important, and it's something that we'll start thinking about a little more, how we might be able to work with our partnering institutions to see how we might be able to help facilitate that harmonization as well. We have a governance manual and the approval of protocol submission. And so this is just, again, some information we presented to the RCMI program directors to talk about what the steering committee has approved as far as some of the action items for the network. So what is the network, right? Who are the people of the network, et cetera? So this is the organizational chart for the network. It's a principal investigator, informed by a steering committee and an external advisory committee. And then the steering committee is composed of a variety of subcommittees, ethics and regulatory, education and dissemination, core resources, protocol review, publications, research committee. And then we have the data and technology coordinating center, the research core, ethics and regulatory specialists, administrative core. And then we have clusters. Who here is involved in one or more clusters, RTRN clusters? Who here has never heard of an RTRN cluster? So the RTRN clusters is a, go ahead. So I asked if anybody who here had not heard of a cluster. So the clusters are, we try to think of them as cyber working groups and cyber thought groups around different disease-focused areas. Even though we talked a lot about health earlier, but these are disease-focused areas because a lot of people, that's right now how people are doing work and how people can come together to focus on addressing a disease and also hopefully focus on coming up with some collaborative projects where maybe they would go forward to put in grant applications. And since NIH is structured with a cancer institute and cardiovascular institute, then we want people to be positioned to be competitive to go for grants from those institutes. And so we've created these working groups, and it's something that as we go forward we'll be thinking about how we can make them the most effective they can be. So one thing that came up was during the discussion was there was too many subcommittees for the steering committee. And for the steering committee, that there needed to be more support for the chair. It was thought that there was probably too many clusters right now. We needed maybe fewer clusters and have a little more focus on making those clusters sort of successful in really coming together, writing papers, writing grant applications. And there's pluses and minuses, because when you get fewer clusters and people are like, well, I'm left out. Where's a cluster for me? Why'd you pick that cluster? Right? Of course there should only be kidney disease clusters. We all know that. So those are some things we've been struggling with, and maybe we'll talk a little bit about this during lunchtime. We've talked about having ambassadors for the cluster. So right now, one of the challenges has been the clusters are just comprised of people who are volunteering because clusters, I want to partner and see what other people are doing and some great ideas. But a lot of people are sort of stretched for time as it is. So it's very difficult to get the clusters together and particularly a lot of the work and ideas that come forward to move that to the next level if somebody does not have dedicated time that buys out their other time to do that. And so it was recommended that we maybe have what's called an ambassador that has time, protected time, to actually lead the clusters and move them forward. And people thought that would be one way to get things up and going. So we've had a lot of conversation with program staff and with the RCMI program directors about that. And then we thought there should also be local ambassadors. So when at each institution, we said, well, what's going on with RTRN and what's going on with other institutions? Who's actually leading our collaborations for getting all the schools in Puerto Rico together for A, B, and C? He says, well, I'm not really sure who's doing it. This and this. I'd like to do it, but I'm too busy. So if each institution had an individual who was responsible for promoting and following up on collaborations, we thought that would be one way to keep the energy moving and to help many of these different activities continue and to move forward in a very positive, proactive way, rather than everybody finally gets together, has a meeting, goes away, and then there's really not much follow-up. Because nobody has the time and nobody's sort of that dedicated, identified point person to move it forward. And so local ambassadors. And we're looking at a combination of strategies for how we support local ambassadors. It'll probably be a combination, or at least we see it as a combination of support coming from RCMI clinical and translational research centers, the G12, other RCMI program project grants such as the G12, so some institutions would have some support there, and to the extent that we can get money set aside within RTRN, that we would have some matching money from RTRN. And so we're looking at a combination of those, but we think it's going to be really important to move the RCMI community forward to have people have dedicated time. In addition to all the other reasons we've talked about today as to why it can be very important to have people networking together, as funds dry up, or at least as funds become less available at the NIH, what happens? Competition goes up. When the competition goes up and they get and NIH gets pressure, where do they say the money should go? To the institutions that have the highest level of funding, that have the most investigators. If we have the critical mass, you should give the money to us. Okay. That conversation does not include our institutions. Okay. So our institutions become much more vulnerable. And our institutions are particularly vulnerable if they are in isolation. They are less vulnerable if they are part of a network. And as a network, we are able to present that the network brings the strength, the resources that's equivalent to a relatively large institution. And therefore, we can then argue that each chain, each link within that chain is important, and that it's critical that we maintain every institution within the network to allow the network to be as productive as it can possibly be. So that is another reason why the network was put together. At least that was the reason why I was excited about being part of the network, because I saw this as extremely important for making sure that each of our institutions was positioned to be in as a competitive position as possible and to be as protected as possible. So at the last meeting at the RCMI Program Directors Association, we talked about having a little more focus for the clusters. Cancer, HIV, AIDS, and other infectious diseases, collapsing some clusters into cardiometabolic so that you didn't have just cardiovascular and sort of diabetes and others, and then neurobehavioral. So that was proposed. There's nothing in stone, but that's what's being proposed. And then sort of cross-cutting, right, because each of these needs support from informatics and should have community engagement cutting across each of these. So those are sort of the cross-cutting clusters. We talked about having one ambassador per cluster because we really thought it was important that for the clusters to be successful, there needs to be support from there. And that would probably come from Arthur. Rick?
So, can you put on the previous slide?
Yes.
And so I'm wondering, within your R-centric consortium, do you have such disease-focused areas?
No, our RCMI program is specifically the 4 areas that we want to develop.
These four?
Yeah,
These same four?
the same 4.
Are you the one who recommended these four? No, I'm just kidding. All right?
Oh, that's good.
So this resonates with Puerto Rico.
Because we did survey the institutions and their research portfolio and looked at morbidity in the island and so on, and we came up with the same 4. The last one we don't call neurobehavioral, just called neuroscience.
Neuroscience? Okay.
It's a minor.
So it's interesting that you shared that, because that in many ways starts to address the question that I asked before about have you gotten together to sort of prioritize.
Well, in the process of putting together a grant application,
Yes.
we did have this discussion with all the 3 institutions. You know, where do you have your resources? Who's doing research and in what area? And so we made a list of the things that we all were doing in all of our institutions and came up with those 4 as the I guess scientific areas to focus on.
Okay.
So do you have like a roster for each of these 4 areas? Both on the clinical side and the basic side?
Roster of investigators.
Right, yeah.
That's being worked on, but not necessarily by area, but as a overall database.
No, but the Vivo, we are also using the Vivo platform. And then I already proposed to Dr. Ortiz here, who is in charge of the portal and so on, so forth, that when we get the roster, it should be classified under the four areas, so that it would be easier for someone who's already looking, you know, for specific areas to have the researchers.
But you know, we've been using this in the pilot project program. So we're telling potential applicants that they have to focus on one of these four areas.
Okay.
Although we got a few that did not address one of these areas specifically. So one of our debates is what to do with those. But we're using these to kind of tell people these are the areas we want to concentrate on. And in fact, when we look at our research portfolio, projects and so on, we try to classify them based on one of these. In some cases there is some overlap. For example, HIV and cancer. They come together in a single project. Or HIV and neuro, yeah. But the point is that in managing our research portfolio and pilot project grant program and resource allocation, we are using these four as our guiding scientific principle.
That's great.
Great.
So if,
Yes.
back to the ambassadors, I was a little confused about the difference between the thematic ambassador and the chair of the cluster. The same person?
So going forward, so right now the chair or cluster leader was someone who's selected, coerced, however they end up being cluster leader. But right now, they're an individual that has probably no protected time to specifically do that task. And so the clusters, I believe, have not been able to achieve their potential because they don't have the support. There's some administrative support they get from RTRN, but they really don't have intellectually the support that's needed to really move the cluster forward. And so the ambassador would be more like the lead individual for the cluster, and it's someone who would have protected time to actually do that and move that forward.
Maybe having one basic.
And then we've sort of been discussing maybe we need two, one who's more basic and one who's more clinical, so that the cluster doesn't go lean all the way to one side or all the way to the other side, like that. Okay, you know, there may be some individuals who have the experiences and enough breadth that they can balance that, but we'll have to see as we go forward. And then they would just be part of the council for the steering committee. That's more of an administrative role, but really to lead the project development, to be looking for funding opportunity announcements, to be taking a lead role probably in putting together applications, or if someone else wants to put together the application, take the lead to support them and help them move that forward. And right now, I think we've not been able to probably capitalize on the intellectual strength and potential of the clusters just because not having some of that infrastructure there. And so the discussion came up, and it was felt that probably 25% effort would be required to really make it happen per se, and that should be provided through RTRN. So that way, if someone's doing that role, they can actually do that role. They're not trying to do it at night in between everything else they're trying to do, as most of us are doing. So this is just a map that just sort of looks at RTRN, at the RCMI committee from a regional perspective. And we had earlier on looked at the possibility of having the regional ambassadors working more from a regional approach. So we've looked at both thematic, we've seen the clusters, but we've also proposed or considered regional approaches. When we talked with the RCMI program directors, their recommendation was that thematic would be better and that we should keep it more thematic and people should look beyond the regions and to look within the RCMI community to see, as clusters are trying to think about projects and they're looking for what are the resources that would be important, that the resources, we should look for whatever the best resources are within the RCMI community and not just within the region. But at least it gives people an idea of where the RCMI institutions are. And of course, while thinking, it's nice to think globally, but action occurs locally. And so having probably a good sense of what's happening more locally is still going to be important for everybody. Starting with our own institutions. This is just a sort of overview of some of the different program project grants across institutions. So some that have G12, RCMI clinical and translational research centers, individuals that have or have relationships with clinical and translational science awardees, the INBRI and COBRI through the IDEA Program Award, U24, those are the two programs that have the VIVO for identifying research scientists, or those are the U24s, right?
Right.
VIVO for scientists, or Eagle Eye for identifying resources, SEPA, the Science Education Program Awards, and then individuals who have the NIMHD Centers of Excellence Awards. And so just a way to be thinking about what resources are both at our own institutions, but also at collaborating institutions and other local and other RCMI institutions. And I think this was going to become important as, and we'll talk a little bit later about developing cores, but as our institutions are thinking about having specific expertise in different areas and having specific strengths, and particularly developing core lab facilities that can be RCMI and national resources, then each institution should think about not only its strengths within a particular program grant, but how it might line up with other program project grants within our individual institutions so that we can have maybe have a strong set of cores there, and then potentially those cores could be national resources and expand the user base by having that strength. So we talked about a little bit about the ambassador program, that these would enhance both the local and thematic collaborative activities, working with RTRN and also working directly with other institutions to develop whatever those institutions feel are in its best interest to advance science and advance collaborations. We feel having the ambassadors would help create a better sense of a distributed network within the RCMI community. So right now you have RTRN, which is sort of the string going across 18 institutions, and at least if we have a few ambassadors across the clusters, then that gives sort of more nodes of groups of activities, and it could probably bring a little more strength to this sort of RTRN string going across the institutions. And then lessons learned. One thing that's going to be really important for each of us, clearly RTRN, we're trying to think about it there, but I think all of us are thinking about lessons learned and how do we share lessons learned. And the hardest thing to share in lessons learned is what didn't work, right? Because we all want to talk about what worked. And it's just, well, Keith, how the hell did the project work? Oh, let me tell you about some stuff we did. It just sucked. Right? It doesn't usually happen. But by not sharing that, then other people are ready to go and duplicate things that didn't work. And it's extremely important, particularly for our institutions. We don't have a lot of resources. So for us to be duplicating things that don't work is really an unfortunate use of our limited resources. So we want to think about how we can get that the lessons learned are true lessons, both what worked and what didn't work. And what didn't work may not have worked just because, not that it was a bad idea, but it didn't work at that different point in time. Maybe it just was not time for that approach to work. Maybe there weren't the resources. Maybe it didn't work, and maybe it was the environment that didn't allow that to work, but it might be a great idea or a great concept or approach for another institution in a different place or a different community. Maybe it didn't work in a particular community, but it might work in another community. So we have to think about how we share those. Scientifically, things that don't work usually don't get published, right? Most journals, hard, you say, oh, I did this study, it didn't show anything. Let me write it up and send it in, get it published. It just doesn't happen. So there's a body of information that stays invisible. And one thing we're trying to think about is how to make that information more visible for our communities. Clearly, from a community level, there are different projects and activities that are happening that, even if they are successful, they usually don't get into the medical literature per se, or at least the peer-reviewed literature. At best, sort of they end up in a foundation's progress report, but really don't hear about it. For the medical community, successes, those usually get published and we can discover those, but what didn't work usually doesn't get published and doesn't become discoverable. And so one thing we want to think about is how we can do a better job as a community for lessons learned. Talked a little bit about the ambassadors, so I won't spend time there. We're moving into lunch. I don't want people throwing food at me. For the ambassadors, we really think it needs to be someone who's a little more senior, because it's easier that, people, they can get the group together. They're not trying to get to a point of tenure where they may be too focused on just trying to get to a tenure position per se. They're more likely to really have the knowledge about their campus. They're more likely to have knowledge about partnering campuses as well. It needs to be someone who has a good relationship with the other faculty. So just because they're senior, right? If they're senior and everybody hates them and doesn't want to work with them, that's probably not going to help. So we need somebody who people say, oh yeah, great, they call me, I'll go work with them, et cetera, et cetera. And we want individuals either be able to rapidly get up to speed, but people who are more senior have probably been around, heard these talks 10, 15 times, they've fallen asleep, they know RTRN, they know they've been to the RCMI meetings, they know other program directors, they know these other institutions. It's going to be easier for them. They can sort of navigate these partnerships much more easily. Similarly, for the thematic clusters, again, someone who has time to put together activities to create a team, because they're not at a point in their career where maybe they have to be focused on doing things for themselves. So it doesn't have to be, but in general, it's going to be more likely to be a mid or senior level investigator, because at this point in their career, they can probably spend more time on putting together a team. Someone who's junior, that may not be something that that's in the best interest of their career right now, or something that their department chair or dean would really support them spending that much of their time trying to put together teams across institutions when they believe that there's other priorities for them. Okay. And again, this sort of same position, same as far as having good interpersonal skills and really being able to work with people and pull a team together. So this just sort of summarizes some things. Again, want them to facilitate science and resource directory. And if not now, a little later, I'll let Dr. Perkins talk a little bit about what we'll be doing from our turn to try to help accelerate each RCMI institution to develop these directories so that we have these directories in place